Module 3 explained how the climate change risk assessment was conducted and how to use it for policy decision-making. ISO 14092 describes the entire process of adaptation planning, from developing adaptation plans to implementing the adaptation measures included in the plans within local governments and communities in developing countries. It also provides guidance on threats in local governments and communities and how to prepare for them. Module 4 provides Japanese case studies on policy decision-making and resource mobilization to implement adaptation measures to address risks in line with ISO. The insights gained from the content of ISO 14092 will help you understand the processes and frameworks needed to develop and implement climate change adaptation plans within local governments and communities. ISO 14092 covers local governments and communities. Here, Module 4 focuses on local government officials and community development officers. While focusing on the three core components of ISO 14092, namely pre-planning, adaptation planning and implementing adaptation measures included in the local adaptation plan, Module 4 will also focus on informative information, best practices and relevant factors for local governments and communities. More detailed and specific information on Chapters 1 to 4 and 9 and 10 of ISO 14092 and Assessing Climate Change Impacts on Chapter 6 will be presented in Modules 2 and 3, respectively. Participants are expected to be able to approach budget authority and donor agencies with strong logic to take action by comparing the actual situation on the ground and learning through ISO 14092. To achieve this, Module 4 will cite successful local cases in other countries, as well as relevant learning factors. Participants will also be expected to tap into these insights and the various tools available to consolidate capacities and mobilize resources to implement adaptation measures. ISO 14092 describes the entire process of adaptation planning within local governments and communities, from developing adaptation plans to implementing the adaptation measures included therein. It also presents guidance for local governments and communities on how to prepare for threats and the associated risks. Part 2 of this training will introduce what local governments have to do to prepare for Step 1, namely to develop a local adaptation plan. This part corresponds to Part 2 of Module 2, Step 1 Pre-planning. The contents and flow of this step are the same when preparing adaptation plans on a local level. Accordingly, the first priority involves identifying the current status of your administrative districts, then understanding the situation before preparing. Local governments often have limited budgets and struggle to provide adequate staffing. Accordingly, even if resources are scarce, other alternatives must be considered. As Module 5 explains in detail, there are many free and publicly available tools that can be used for adaptation planning. In some cases, local governments also need to use these tools to build their own logic when conducting impact assessments and so on. Of course, this can be done by the local government officials themselves, but it is also beneficial to work with academic experts who may lack direct expertise in the particular issue of adaptation. If the municipality has a university or research institute in its area, collaborating with researchers may be possible. The local government will consider and sometimes combine these various alternatives available for adaptation. Local government officials need to develop adaptation plans aimed at avoiding and minimizing losses and damage caused by climate change. In this context, the key points described in ISO 14092 are: consistency with other plans, what the team needs to develop the adaptation planning, how to work with interested parties. First, let's examine the first point. Part 2 of Module 2 shows the horizontal integration. It is important to integrate adaptation measures in relevant sectors. The same applies to local adaptation plans, which must be coordinated with other plans developed by each sector, rather than being standalone. This is called mainstreaming. If a regional disaster risk reduction (DRR) plan is made without considering the other local plans, including those on regional development from other sectors, it will be ineffective. In other words, consistency is crucial. For example, the development of a land use plan should not involve new residential spaces that encompass areas expected to be at risk of river flooding due to climate change. The same applies when updating subsequent sector plans. If a sector plan that ignores the foreseeable future is developed, potential upcoming disasters could severely damage the area, necessitating enormous reconstruction investment on the part of the local government. Accordingly, as well as understanding the needs of each sector, incorporating an adaptation plan into the sector planning process is also important. Next, this slide shows who needs to do what needs to be done and to what extent, for local government officials to actually take the adaptation planning forward. Let's examine them step by step. First, it is necessary to identify the essential people and expertise from the various parties and form teams comprising those people. Understanding the basic roles and responsibilities of each team is also important. ISO 14092 explains that when preparing for planning, two teams need to be formed. In the ISO description, for example, a body such as the Climate Change Adaptation Committee, comprising the mayor and department heads, is considered the core decision-making team. And its secretariat and resource persons collectively equate to the facilitation team at the city level. However, in rural areas where resources are limited, obtaining the right skill sets, for example, the required personnel and expertise, may be trickier. Accordingly, it is important to build a system of regular cooperation and collaboration with local universities and other research institutes, NGOs, local companies and local community members. The core decision-making team has decision-making authority when preparing the plan, for which it is also accountable. It is also responsible for supporting the interested parties and mobilizing financial resources. The final decision-makers for the sector and for mobilizing funds to achieve mainstreaming include governors, mayors, other local chief executives as well as department heads as the members for this team. Local governments must appoint such persons in advance. Conversely, the facilitation team clarifies the roles and responsibilities and prepares the adaptation planning, including the steps and tasks in the adaptation plan, how long the activities last and the proposed available resources, working with environmental department that will serve as secretariat and other departments, as well as other relevant parties such as non-governmental organizations and research institutes, etc. Ideally, the team should comprise people with various professional backgrounds such as climate science and DRR management. In some cases, those overseeing the environment as secretariat members might be well placed to listen to recommendations from experts. In other cases, they may be in a position to provide input such as risk assessments to the adaptation plan, just like an expert. As mentioned earlier, when addressing the importance of mainstreaming, this is not a simple story that can be completed only by the sole department, underlining the need to collaborate with other related departments. This is an example of good practice where the core decision-making team and facilitation team functioned mutually, and top-down decision-making spawned very successful interdepartmental collaboration. In this initiative, JCA has joined as a donor. The Bangkok Metropolitan Administration, BMA, has been facing significant challenges in terms of both mitigation and adaptation measures due to devastating floods to date. Formerly, only the Environment Department, which heads the BMA, was responsible when it came to climate change initiatives. However, acknowledging climate change countermeasures as a cross-sectoral issue and the need for measures that transcend departmental boundaries and cooperation with other departments, the Governor of the Metropolitan Government, department heads and other senior officials decided to establish a cross-departmental organization led by the Environment Department. This paved the way to promote interdepartmental cooperation, develop an implementation system involving relevant organizations outside the BMA and formulate plans consistent with national policies. Finally, the Bangkok Master Plan on Climate Change 2013–2023 was completed and approved. Local adaptation plans are not completed by the government alone. Residents, individuals in the private sector and others are both victims of weather hazards and also actors in mitigating damage. This ranges from short-term actions, such as evacuation, to long-term initiatives like land purchases. NGOs are also tasked with representing a facilitation team for issues the government finds difficult to handle. Flood control measures and logistics of neighboring municipalities often affect each other. They might be able to share and flex resources usable for adaptation measures. There is a key need to involve interested parties in the planning process to stimulate broader commitment. Please refer to Module 5 for tools to support community-based adaptation planning. The following is a case study of good practices of community participation conducted by the Ministry of the Environment Japan. MOEJ in a river basin around Lake Laguna in the Philippines and in the coastal area of Mindoro Island. The models used for the river basin and coastal area projects differ, as do the implementing bodies involved. The former was implemented by the Laguna Lake Development Authority and the latter by the local government unit. However, in both cases, the interested parties discussed the desired future of the river basin and coastal areas with local residents involved, which ultimately led to the land being modified. They have also been working to share knowledge and develop human resources. In these projects, they also created and improved operational guidelines, held a presentation meeting with the local governments in the pilot site, trained local government officials and distributed the operational guidelines to participants in electronic media. As mentioned in the previous sections of Modules 3 and 4, many stakeholders have to be involved in adaptation pre-planning, which may include those who are unfamiliar with the climate change field itself. When local governments with limited resources assess climate change impact, it is important to share climate projection data with other departments so that they can actually consider what might happen and the nature of the risks in their respective sectors. If necessary, it might make sense to hold study sessions and meetings to exchange views with each sector department. In 2010, Nagano Prefecture, Japan, established an adaptation study group comprising 7 sectors within the prefectural government, including the Crisis Management Department, Agriculture Department and Tourism Department. The study group first held a study session to ensure a certain level of understanding across the organization. Moreover, over 100 people attended the study session, including residents. The adaptation package shown on screen was created by the prefectural government, but this process has now spawned a platform for communication, not only with the stakeholders of the subcommittee task forces for each field, but prefectural citizens as well. Let's now review Part 2. The key in local adaptation pre-planning is to ensure consistency with other sectoral plans. Here, it is important to form an appropriate team for adaptation planning and engage with interested parties, including local residents. These 3 points are what underpin Part 2. In the next part, we will examine what the local government needs to do to develop an adaptation plan after pre-planning. Part 3 of this training will introduce usable tools and examples, as well as sample table contents in the adaptation plan for local municipalities that have already been planned by other cities in Japan, while focusing on what needs to be considered when local adaptation planning. This part corresponds to Part 3, Planning for Climate Change Adaptation of Module 2. This section centers on identifying potential adaptation measures, assessing adaptation measures, decision-making, local adaptation plan. With these points in mind, planning for your administrative districts as Step 2 is important. Module 3 explained regarding impact assessment. Based on its results, it is necessary to develop an adaptation plan as the local government and community shall aim to undertake an adaptation planning process to secure people's life and property from the adverse impacts, both current and in the future, while taking advantage of opportunities as a result of climate change and those arising from adaptation measures introduced. To address vulnerabilities and risks already identified through impact and risk assessments, there is a need to seek out and consider good adaptation measures elsewhere. There are 3 types of potential adaptation measures in the local area: soft, gray and green measures. Soft measures, as defined by ISO, refer to adaptive capacity such as human and financial resources. Conversely, in this material, as already explained in Module 2, for example, planning and evacuation drills are shown as examples of soft measures. The ISO also refers to gray measures as infrastructure and technology, but this textbook covers DRR measures through civil engineering works such as embankments. Now, what exactly are green measures? Green measures are DRR measures based on ecosystems. They refer to a method that utilizes pre-existing resources in the community and capable of constituting effective countermeasure. Examples include safety forests to prevent landslides and flood control forests to protect riverbanks from erosion. Another example is the use of natural topography to divide flows of water and reduce their force by rerouting them toward a huge rock. Healthy ecosystems make society less vulnerable, as physical buffers mitigating dangerous natural phenomena and supporting human livelihoods such as the supply of food and resources. This concept is called eco-DRR and is truly a green measure. It is important to optimally exploit what exists in the region and understand what constitutes effective adaptation measures. From these soft, gray and green measures, candidate adaptation measures can be identified. The next step involves assessing adaptation measures. Local governments and communities need to assess which potential climate change adaptation measures best fit local needs and capabilities, using decision-making methods commensurate with their circumstances and climate change. ISO 14092 describes a SWOT analysis as one of the appropriate methods for assessing adaptation measures, which is a framework for analyzing the current situation and giving a picture of the current state of the community. In Kuki City, Saitama Prefecture, as part of efforts to get upcoming urban development on the right track, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of the external environment within the city shown on screen were identified and the strategic issues analyzed. This was done to determine the importance of promoting the development of a central park as a base for disasters to strengthen future weaknesses. Also important is selecting appropriate adaptation measures from a list of candidate measures, taking factors such as the characteristics of local culture and traditions into account. ISO also cites the cost-benefit analysis as a useful method. Although very convincing as a basis for EBPM when extrapolating the cost of avoidable damage from future disasters is feasible, Module 3 also reaffirms that this would involve considerable detailed analysis and challenging work. Unlike when determining the benefits of projects like road and airport construction, the benefits of adaptive measures, such as gray and disaster prevention works, are harder to discern. The expected benefit is the scope of damage reduction achievable by coastal disaster prevention, despite the fact we have no idea what kind of disaster will occur going forward. MOEJ has been conducting a 5-year project called Strategic Research on Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation since fiscal year 2015, which includes a study on the cost-benefit of global adaptation to climate change. The study found that the damage caused by coastal flooding is $42.5 billion a year, and if Japan could invest about 10% of its annual national budget in adaptation measures yearly, it could save sums of future damage that would otherwise occur equivalent to from $768 billion to $1.2845 trillion. Given the limited budget, it can be used to select the most efficient and effective adaptation measures. Annex C of ISO 14092 sets out example indicators that can help decision-makers. For example, indicators related to flooding include the number of people permanently displaced by flooding, the number of properties lost per year due to flooding, and the number of years since flood risk assessments were conducted in cities. It is important to reference these indicators and involve interested parties in the decision-making process of selecting appropriate adaptation measures. Annex A of ISO 14092 provides a table of contents for an adaptation plan in 4 randomly selected cities worldwide. Comparing them reveals how the adaptation plans differ depending on the population size involved, from hundreds of thousands in large cities like Vancouver, Canada, to small towns with populations in the thousands. These can be points of reference when establishing the adaptation plan for your own administrative districts. In an internationally renowned city like Vancouver, the local government can probably do a lot of the planning itself, or they can outsource the planning to a consultant for more specialized content, if necessary. The city of Vancouver has about 600,000 people. Metro Vancouver has an overall population of approximately 2.5 million, and the province of British Columbia, which includes Metro Vancouver, has a population of approximately 4.5 million. Japan is divided into 47 prefectures, one of which is Tokyo, home to around 14 million people. The Kanto region, which also includes Tokyo, has a population of over 40 million. The population and area of the Kanto region of Japan naturally differ from those of the Canadian provinces, hindering efforts to make a simple comparison. From the next slide, some examples of local governments in Japan having already made adaptation plans, from standard to unique, are shown. Module 3 explained Japan's Climate Change Impact Assessment Report. Referencing this report, each municipality in Japan is developing a local adaptation plan. The case shown is Aomori Prefecture in Japan, which exemplifies a standard adaptation plan. Overall, the prefectural population has been declining year on year and is now a small municipality with about 1.2 million residents. Within this prefecture, even before the Climate Change Adaptation Act set by the national government in 2018, they decided to promote adaptation measures as future countermeasures, including the avoidance and mitigation of damage expected now or in future, besides the mitigation measures already taken. In addition, based on the Climate Change Impact Assessment Report of Japan, the prefecture has organized and selected 38 sub-items in 21 items from 7 target sectors to be addressed. Half the total 35-page plan lists the expected impacts of each area and item, as well as specific adaptation measures. Using this adaptation plan as a basis, the next slide will introduce some of the unique features of other local municipalities in Japan. Next is the example adaptation plan in Hokkaido, Japan. 5.4 million people live within it, less than half the population of Tokyo. However, with an area exceeding 83,000 square kilometers, it is the largest prefecture, comprising around 22% of Japan's land area and occupying a key food supply role. Recent years have seen Hokkaido experience an unprecedented heatwave and record-breaking torrential rain, and the effects and impact of climate change have been felt over wide-ranging fields, including industry, natural ecosystems and residents' lives. This plan comprises a total of 41 pages, from the background and formulation in Chapter 1 to measures to promote adaptation in Chapter 7. With this background in mind, the plan is characterized by priority efforts in agriculture, forestry, fisheries, the natural environment and natural disasters. As one of the world's largest cities, Tokyo has not only a huge population but also an exceptionally large budget, usually around 7 trillion yen a year. Accordingly, the plan is diverse and includes adaptation plans for each field and issue. This plan comprises 5 chapters and 50 pages. The table of contents includes past conditions and predicted future changes in climate, basic approach to adaptation, climate change impacts and policies for response, and promotion of adaptation measures. In particular, future actions include plans for various fields and issues, such as natural disasters, health, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, water resources and the natural environment, as well as a long-term roadmap for strengthening adaptation measures, including not only policy goals for 2030, but also a vision for 2050. The next case study involves a small city with a population of approximately 70,000, at prefectural-level municipalities. Otawara City in Tochigi Prefecture is located about 150 kilometers north of Tokyo. Although lacking any major industry other than the production of chili peppers, this plan was formulated with the aim of creating a city where citizens could live with peace of mind, as the impact of climate change is becoming increasingly apparent in the city every year. However, the lack of information and data on the effects of climate change in the city has seen this plan drafted as version 0, which sets the basic direction. Nevertheless, the 19-page plan includes information on future changes in temperature and precipitation citywide, visible in the free tools introduced in Module 5, as well as information on the implementation system and the roles of government, citizens and businesses in promoting adaptation measures. It also states that the plan will be revised as soon as the latest scientific findings in the region have been compiled. Even in a small city with limited budget and workforce, the plan is unique in that it clearly states that all departments will collaborate to promote adaptation measures, working with local research institutes, the prefecture and the national government. Here are 6 points to consider when drafting a local adaptation plan. The first is the importance of ensuring that the local adaptation plan is expressed in clear and easily readable language, so that it can be easily understood by everyone. The second point. Given the often extensive geographic impacts of weather-related disasters, the scope of this plan must be determined first. Third point. The boundaries of the administrative divisions must be effectively recognized to avoid conflicts with neighboring administrative districts. The fourth point is that when a local adaptation plan is developed, including its purpose and scope and the ways and means to achieve it, the areas that should be made public must be identified and published. Fifth point. Consultation on the draft adaptation plan should ensue, not only with the local government but also with a wide range of interested parties, both within and outside the local community. Sixth, the final adaptation plan needs to be approved by all the heads of the departments involved, followed by the council and finally the mayor, governor, or other chief executive. With these points in mind, the local adaptation plan is finally complete. These are some of the points to be considered when drafting a local adaptation plan. Now, let's review Part 3. The first step in developing a local adaptation plan is to identify potential candidates for adaptation measures in the locality. Next, use appropriate methods to evaluate the adaptation options and assess whether they are optimally suited to local needs and capabilities. The decision is made by referring to metrics that are useful for decision makers, involving interested parties and selecting the appropriate adaptation measures. Finally, the local adaptation plan is completed after consulting with the interested parties within and outside the administrative district and gaining the approval of the relevant heads of department, parliament and local leaders. These key points underpin Part 3. Part 4 of this training will introduce the implementation phase of adaptation measures based on the local adaptation plans, starting from the basic implementation cycle and ending with the implementation of adaptation measures, using tools and examples. This part corresponds to Part 4, Implementation of Climate Change Adaptation, of Module 2. The main points here are: understanding the basic cycle, leadership and commitment, preparing to implement adaptation measures, implementing adaptation measures. With these 4 points in mind, the implementation of adaptation measures based on the local adaptation plan as Step 3, will be carried out. Now, let's understand the basic cycle for commercializing adaptation measures in local areas. This diagram can be found at the beginning of ISO 14092. Moving clockwise, this is how the international standard defines the cycle, starting with local adaptation pre-planning, followed by impact assessment, adaptation planning and implementation of adaptation measures based on the adaptation plan, and finally for further improvement. The part that corresponds to Step 3 shown in the previous slide, in other words, Part 4, corresponds to implementing in the acting section shown in the figure. Henceforth, we will examine the contents necessary to proceed with implementing. Chapter 8 of ISO 14092 explains that the core decision-making team, which comprises the chief executive and department heads, must network with interested parties and adjacent local governments and communities to demonstrate leadership. This is an important aspect of leadership and commitment. A guidebook exists, with examples from Canada for mayors, councillors and other municipal decision-makers to promote climate change adaptation. It details the requirements for leaders in the community, how to work with the various interested parties and who should spearhead the community outreach efforts at the heart of adaptation. It can be leveraged as a tool to build and sustain momentum for sustained climate change adaptation action on a political level. Next, let's examine the preparation to implement adaptation measures. The 2 main aspects of preparation described in the ISO are the integration into various policies and strategies decided by the local government and correct understanding on the part of taxpayers. Accordingly, the ISO explains that the concept of adaptation should be incorporated into the daily work performed by local government officials. Specifically, this means actually carrying out disaster resilience construction such as river improvement, based on the local adaptation plan, and providing risk information to residents. It also means placing the perspective of adaptation measures at the center of other sectoral plans, for example, for land use or river management. If the implementation of adaptation measures is not at the top of the list, securing the relevant budget will not be possible. Adaptation also involves investing taxpayers' money to prevent disasters that may, or may not, happen in future. Accordingly, any mobilization of resources is contingent on the understanding of the residents involved. There are also 2 key points regarding the content of the implementation plan when implementing adaptation measures. The first is the need to record the costs and the second, the expected results. Documenting these things is crucial as part of efforts to implement better adaptation measures going forward. The second point. Module 3 underlined the importance of predicting and assessing based on scientific evidence. Also crucial is assessing the risks and opportunities gleaned from these impact assessments in the planning process to implement adaptation measures and mobilize resources. Now, let's examine Japan's adaptation measures that can be benchmarks for each field and issue. From the next slide onward, a total of 5 examples of DRR, agriculture and heatstroke countermeasures are shown. First, let's examine a case of river flooding in the DRR field. The lower reaches of the Tsurumi River, which flows through Yokohama City in Kanagawa Prefecture, have been long prone to river flooding, causing considerable damage. Shin Yokohama Park at Riverside is normally used by citizens for recreation, but also functions as a flood control facility during flooding. When the river level rises above a certain level, the swollen river water is temporarily drawn into the facility and stored there to mitigate downstream flood damage. This park also houses a huge stadium that was used for the FIFA World Cup and Rugby World Cup. It is a pilot-type structure with only pillars on the ground, supported by more than 1,000 thick pillars. The wide space between the pillars allows water to be stored underneath the stadium in case of flooding. The city of Yokohama is also implementing wide-ranging adaptation measures, such as constructing a 20 km long underground tunnel to protect low-lying areas from flooding, as a countermeasure for inland flooding, which occurs when the drainage capacity of the sewage system cannot keep pace with the rainwater volume. One factor behind the progress of these adaptation measures is that in 2011, the city achieved a first in Japan by establishing an organization equivalent to a bureau, Climate Change Policy Headquarters, to address the issue department-wide and position adaptation measures as part of the city's action plan right from the start. In addition, to boost awareness of the importance of adaptation, the city has been striving to disseminate information and raise awareness more effectively by distributing questionnaires among citizens and businesses and soliciting opinions from citizens, thereby deepening citizens' understanding. Accordingly, the city of Yokohama has been able to raise citizen awareness, which has also paved the way to mobilize resources more effectively. This is followed by the second DRR case study. Saga Prefecture has developed and refined a high-precision model capable of quantitatively evaluating the effectiveness of adaptation measures against storm surge and flood inundation. This will be used for the prefecture's DRR management going forward with the future climate in mind. The scope will include, for example, confirming the effectiveness of disaster mitigation measures such as the effective use of drainage pumps for inland floods, which have already been installed in the plains, and opening and closing sluice gates more accurately, since opening them too early or late can cause more damage from flooding. Although this case study has not yet reached the stage of implementing adaptation measures, highly feasible adaptation measures utilizing storm surge countermeasures installed in the plains have already been formulated and will be promoted as countermeasures for flooding damage caused by storm surges. This is followed by the third case of DRR. Gifu Prefecture has been facing repeated disasters in mountainous areas, as well as a shrinking and aging population. Consequently, many efforts have been made, including developing a method to show changes in the scale and frequency of floods due to climate change. The success of these efforts can be attributed to the effective functioning of the cross-departmental meeting body established within the prefectural government, Agency Liaison Council. The Liaison Council played a central role in sorting and listing hundreds of projects that each department had been working on, which could be considered adaptation measures, thereby lowering the psychological hurdle for the staff and fostering the mindset of all departments to consider adaptation measures. Next, we examine the industrial sector. Ibaraki is one of the leading national prefectures in agricultural terms, housing more farmers in Japan than any other. In recent years, high temperatures have seen more and more substandard rice crops, which has affected farmers' income. Accordingly, the prefectural government and the university have collaborated to create a package of adaptation measures, that includes an impact assessment at the municipal level. The scope of the package includes not only developing new rice varieties and technologies, but also a complete picture of various adaptation measures, such as cultivation techniques, infrastructure and the introduction of public systems. Consequently, 1 year after the start of the project, the prefectural government presented a package of adaptation measures, including fertilizer and water management, and introduced varieties tolerant to high temperatures, which was highly commended by the farmers. This is an excellent example of how the prefectural government, university, municipalities and students were all involved in the project, from the initial stage when awareness of the issue among those in the prefecture and many other parties involved was lacking, through repeated creativity and ingenuity and accumulating practical examples of adaptation measures. Next is a case study in the environmental impact field. Saitama Prefecture in Japan is prone to extreme heat, often breaking nationwide records. This is exacerbated by the heat island effect, which has seen a growing number of people suffering from heat stroke in recent years. With the Rugby World Cup scheduled to be held in Saitama Prefecture in 2019, a working group comprising prefectural government, national research institutes and universities was established. The former was in charge of identifying targets for which counter-technologies could be applied and verified, while the latter was tasked with developing heat simulation technologies. Consequently, the shaded area in the vicinity of the stadium was boosted by 40% by planting trees, and moves to develop the environmental performance of permeable pavements were commercialized. A technical staff member of the Parks and Stadium Division, who showed a keen interest in scientific approaches and evidence, reflected major success in mediating between the Department of the Environment and the Department of Land Development, spawning a cross-departmental joint project and social implementation as an adaptation measure. This is a case where mainstreaming of adaptation, which cites the impact of climate change as a precondition for the actions and choices of all individuals, is evident, from the bottom up and eventually involving senior management. Now, let's review the contents of Part 4. It is important that the implementation of adaptation measures included in local adaptation plans should proceed step by step, based on the basic cycle defined in the international standard. With this in mind, the core decision-making team will network with interested parties and adjacent local governments and communities. It is also crucial to document inputs and outputs and assess risks and opportunities to mobilize resources thoroughly. Implementing adaptation measures means considering not only the attitude of the organization as a whole, but also effectively disseminating information and raise awareness of the importance of adaptation, benchmarking examples of adaptation measures in Japan that led to resources being mobilized. This is the final Part 5. To date, Parts 1 to 4 have introduced the core of ISO, from pre-planning to the implementation of adaptation measures. In this part, we will review each step as a summary. First, in Part 1, after reviewing Module 3, ISO 14092 and the structure and purpose of this module were explained. In other words, the key is to learn from past successes and the factors behind them, to consolidate capacity and mobilize resources to implement adaptation measures. In Part 2, the role of local governments in pre-planning was explained in more detail. In local adaptation pre-planning, it is important to ensure consistency with other sectoral plans, form appropriate teams for adaptation planning and work with interested parties, including local residents. Part 3 introduced tools and examples capable of functioning as benchmarks for local governments with limited resources. The first step in local adaptation planning involves identifying potential adaptation candidates in the area and assessing whether they are suitable for local needs and capabilities. Then, by referring to informative indicators, involving stakeholders and making decisions to select appropriate adaptation measures, a local adaptation plan is developed that paves the way for all parties to understand as well as being commensurate for the population. Finally, the local adaptation plan is completed after a series of consultations with interested parties within and outside the administrative district and following approval by the heads of the relevant departments, the council and local leaders. Part 4 has introduced specific good practices and success factors behind adaptation measures in each issue and field from the perspective of what would actually benefit local governments. To implement the adaptation measures included in local adaptation plans, the basic cycle, as defined in international standards, should be understood, and the core decision-making team should network with interested parties and neighboring local governments and communities. It is also important to prepare to implement adaptation by documenting inputs and outputs, assessing risks and opportunities, and collaborating with local governments to mobilize resources, as well as the proactively disseminating information and raising awareness to ensure people have an in-depth understanding of adaptation. We have now summarized each part. Finally, here is the summary for Module 4. This module aims to help local governments and communities, which have limited resources compared to the government, improve their ability to explain their budgets with strong logic and rational persuasion, citing scientific evidence via various tools and learning from useful examples and their success factors. This is the big picture of Module 4. Pre-investing for DRR will help mitigate the damage to the community from future disasters. Again, mobilizing resources for the implementation of adaptation measures is crucial. Implementing this in local government is contingent on local government officials and community development officers understanding the overall adaptation process. Module 4 introduced good practices in local areas and their success factors, as well as certain tools that were useful in promoting local adaptation. As well as a detailed description of the tools discussed in each module to date, including modules 2 and 3, the next module 5 will introduce free tools that can be useful in adaptation planning and information on tools related to scientific and community-based approaches.